Hello, my name is Jessica Rothney and I'm Policy Manager at the GDC. Welcome to this GDC presentation on the Scope of Practice Review, which complements the independent research we have published recently on our website. This presentation will focus mainly on the research report and findings, and then I will present some figures around scope of practice cases in fitness practice, and finally I will touch briefly on what this all means for the scope of practice guidance in the future. But firstly, let's establish why this research has been commissioned and why we are undertaking a review of the scope of practice. All dental professionals will be familiar with the GDC's scope of practice guidance in one way or another. It was originally created in 2009 following the introduction of GDC registration of all dental care professionals to clarify for both patients and registrants the general skills and tasks each of the DCP titles were expected to undertake. This was intended as a means of ensuring patient protection so that patients were able to access information about the different professional skills and duties, and registrants did not stray from their scope, which could potentially put patients at risk. The current format of the guidance is a list of tasks that GDC registrants can undertake, subject to being trained, competent, and indemnified within each different registrant title. While there is a section for dentists, there is no set list of tasks a dentist can perform, as dentists are permitted under the Dentist Act to carry out tasks that are the practice of dentistry. Therefore, when we speak about scope of practice, we are referring to the scope of DCPs, as dentists ultimately do not have a limitation set on them in terms of what they can or cannot do within the practice of dentistry. So, why is the GDC conducting a review of the scope of practice? So the guidance was last updated in 2013, and we as the GDC have a responsibility to maintain its currency and relevance. However, gaps in the list of tasks and a lack of clarity around what is included or not included often leads to complex questions being posed to the GDC about how the guidance should be interpreted in a clinical environment. This has caused us to question whether the current format is the best option going forward and whether this prescriptive listing of tasks supports professionals to make their own decisions about their scope. And so we have used this opportunity to conduct a wider review rather than just simply a light touch review of the list of tasks. We want the new approach to be fit for purpose, in line with our bigger vision for supporting professionals, which is to support professional judgment and decision making. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought a fresh perspective on the limitations of the scope of practice document. The current document may not only limit professionals from acting flexibly, but may act as a barrier to proactively deploying dental professionals in new ways. And so we commissioned an independent research company to further understand how the guidance is being used in the clinical environment, what the perceptions are of the current document, and what the impact of this guidance has been, both intended and unintended. And lastly, what professionals and stakeholders felt the scope of practice should look like in the future. Now I'm going to briefly describe the design and methodology of the research. The research was contracted to and conducted by the independent research company IFF. So to be clear, while the GDC helped to design the research, the findings and conclusions are IFF's, not the GDC's. The research findings, therefore, do not automatically reflect the GDC's direction with scope of practice, but the findings do help us to inform our decisions. Firstly, there was the scoping stage. The key objective of this was to understand the context of the scope of practice document and develop a logic model to map out the outcomes and impacts of the document. The stakeholder workshop then discussed the findings from the scoping stage of the research and the logic model in detail to help shape the focus of the main stage of the research. The main stage involved 6 group discussions working with the different DCP groups separately, except clinical dental technicians, where it was difficult to draw together a full group, and so 2 in-depth interviews were undertaken. Then there were 2 discussion groups with members of the public and 9 interviews with key GDC stakeholders. There were also some questions added to the annual dental professional survey conducted by the GDC. Now I'm going to move on to discuss the findings, firstly looking at how the document is used and understood by dental professionals. In general, dental professionals were confident and clear when it came to their own scope, but had less clarity when it came to the scope of their peers, other dental professionals. This was particularly true of dentists who were less than clear of the scopes of each of the different DCP title groups. DCPs, however, felt that dentists should know the scope of all DCP groups to ensure that they can refer and work with them appropriately. When it came to looking to the scope of practice document itself, only some dental professionals would use the guidance document. Most individuals interviewed and participating in the workshops would contact the GDC or their professional bodies or colleagues to seek clarity if they needed to. Overall, DCPs were more familiar with the guidance document than dentists. Hygienists, therapists and orthodontic therapists seemed more familiar, whilst dental nurses appeared to be the least familiar. Use of the guidance document itself varied quite a bit amongst dental professionals. Some were regularly using it, whilst some never used it. With the stakeholder interviews, interestingly, it revealed that they were more likely than dental professionals to be regularly using the scope of practice document. Next, I'm going to discuss the impact of the scope of practice document on practice and the perceptions around this. In regards to how scope of practice impacts patient safety in working outside of scope, dental professionals generally felt that straying out of scope was not done on purpose, but more when trying to give the patient the best treatment possible. For DCPs, the potential for working outside of scope came down to the relationship with the dentist and the power employment dynamic. DCPs might be asked to carry something out which they felt was out of scope and then either had to push back or comply. The scope of practice document was felt by some to be a good tool to demonstrate something was out of scope to the dentist. The research also explored how the scope of practice document impacted on use of skill mix amongst the team and career pathways for DCPs. There were some fears that the guidance could inhibit skill mix where tasks were not exclusively stated in the guidance. Again, the influence of the dentist on DCP's scope was raised. DCPs rely on dentists to make referrals which maximise their skills and give them opportunities. From a stakeholder's perspective, educators felt that DCP's skills were not being maximised in the main. When discussing the additional skills section of the guidance document, very few DCP participants used this section or understood how to achieve those skills listed. Overall, it was felt that the guidance document clearly outlines and separates different roles of the dental team, and that the document should continue to exist and be updated. Now I'm going to highlight some findings from the workshops with members of the public. While the public had some awareness about the different roles and members of the dental team, when shown the scope of practice guidance document, they were generally not familiar with the document and also felt, when looking at it more closely, that it was not accessible or designed for them. When asked for feedback on how this document might be more accessible for patients in the public, they felt it would need to be shortened, made interactive, or be produced as a poster for dental clinics. Overall, the public did not feel that the guidance document was designed for them or something that they would have use for in the future. That brings us to the end of the highlights from the commissioned research. To find out more, please visit the research page of the GDC website where you can read the report in full. In undertaking our review of scope of practice, it's also important that the GDC considers how the scope of practice document impacts our own processes and business. In particular, how scope cases feature and progress through fitness to practice. To that end, I'm going to share some high-level figures of scope of practice cases in fitness to practice. So firstly, let's look at scope of practice cases in the wider context of fitness to practice. Over 5 years between 2015 and 2019, there were a total of 9,513 cases raised with the GDC, including dentists and DCPs. Of that total, 1,296, or 14%, related to dental care professionals. And of all the DCP concerns raised to the GDC in those 5 years, 24% involved a concern about scope of practice. To note here, these figures reflect all incoming concerns raised with the GDC, and so many of these are closed at various different stages of the fitness to practice process. Now to look at scope of practice cases across each of the DCP titles from that same 5-year period. The first column lists all of the DCP groups on the register. It's important to be mindful that some professionals have more than one DCP title, so concerns will be counted for each title held. In the second column, we can see the spread of cases across each title, with technicians and dental nurses being most frequently reported. The third column translates these figures to percentages. So technicians constituted 36% of all scope cases, and dental nurses constituted 33% of scope cases. Orthodontic therapists and hygienists had the lowest number of concerns raised. The fourth column gives a breakdown of the DCP register as a whole. In 2019, there were a total of just under 77,000 DCPs on the register, and 77% of those were dental nurses. Interestingly, we can then see that while dental technicians are only 8% of the DCP register, they make up 36% of scope of practice concerns. While dental nurses are the second highest number of scope concerns, they are underrepresented compared to their makeup on the register. On the flip side, while CDTs only make up less than 1% of the DCP register, they make up 14% of all scope of practice cases. You may notice that dentists are not included in these figures. As I mentioned earlier, we don't generally consider dentists to have a scope of practice as they don't have any restrictions on their practice. And so concerns which you might consider out of scope for a dentist would ultimately be more about a dentist's training and competence, their ability to perform a skill, rather than straying out of scope per se. Now we will take a look at the figures at the hearing stage, which is the most serious stage of fitness to practice. DCPs involved in cases that end up at a hearing are made up exclusively of dental technicians, dental nurses, and clinical dental technicians, with technicians having the highest number of scope of practice cases at this stage. Cases involving the other DCP groups did not typically reach a hearing and were closed down in the earlier stages of the fitness to practice process, usually the case examiner stage. This gives some indication as to the seriousness of breaches of scope of practice that are reported across each of the different DCP groups. Lastly, we will look at outcomes of scope of practice cases at a hearing. The question is, are there serious sanctions imposed on scope of practice cases that end up at a hearing? The answer is yes. This chart shows that the most common outcomes of these cases are suspension, erasure, or reprimand. It was less likely that a case would result in an outcome where fitness to practice was found not to be impaired. What this tells us is that if and when a scope of practice case does end up at a hearing, the GDC finds that there is sufficient concern for patient safety that a serious sanction is needed. That brings us to the end of the evidence and insights we have been considering to date in developing our approach to the scope of practice for the future. In summary, the GDC acknowledges the views and concerns arising out of the research in relation to the future of scope of practice. Dental professionals and stakeholders who participated in the research were concerned about the prospect of the guidance document no longer existing in its current form. The GDC is considering this research and other evidence collected in forming our plan for the scope of practice. As the regulator, we need to balance the findings against our own strategy to create a more professionally led system that supports and empowers professionals to make decisions. And we hope to do this by moving away from setting rules and lists and towards setting principles which professionals can apply for their own circumstances. This way of regulating ultimately places more trust in professionals to make their own decisions, of which they are best placed to do, rather than the regulator. The Scope of Practice Review is an ongoing project, and we will be looking to engage with professionals and stakeholders further as we develop our plans. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the GDC's update on the Scope of Practice Review.